Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Samach Daled. Nice to be back on Zoom. Nice to see all the people I'm used to teaching every morning. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island in honor of the birth of a grandson to our friend and co-learner Tzipi Wolkenfeld. May the entire family rejoice as they are zochet to raise the new daf Yomi addition to Torah, Chuppah, and Maasim Tovim. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We have basically two sections of today's daf. The first one is a continuation from yesterday's daf. And the next one is the next Mishna and a whole sugya on that Mishna. I would say maybe in between there's a very small sugya, and then there's one main sugya for the second part. Rav Dimi had said in the Hadran that someone who sells a house, even if the person says, I'm selling you the umka veruma, okay, meaning the heights and the depths, right, the airspace above and below the house, that doesn't include a bore or a dut, okay, a pit or a cistern. Today we'll see what the difference between the two is. Doesn't include that. Why? Because a basic sale of a house, according to Rav Dimi, is just the house. If you say umka beruma, the depths and heights, that includes something further, which is the part below and the part above, okay, the rights to dig, the rights to build, okay, or the airspace. But in order to sell the bore and the dut in your sale, you would have to go one step farther. You would have to say till the depths, or till, right, to a stronger language, to the heights of the sky. Once you do that, you're obviously meaning something more, so then you're going to include the bore and the dut. The main thing that Rav Dimi is saying, which the Gemara is pointing out, is that a basic sale of a house without saying anything, what we call stama, you just say, I'm selling a house, doesn't include airspace below or above. To which the Gemara yesterday in yesterday's daf, tried to bring a proof for this from the next Mishna. It was unsuccessful because they said it could be explained in other ways. And we're going to do the same thing now. There's basically three sections here. The first is the one we did yesterday, which is an attempt to prove it from the next Mishna. Now we're actually going to try to prove Rav Dimi from our Mishna. Okay? And that's going to be the second part. And the third part is going to be an attempt to show that there's some Emora who disagrees with Rav Dimi, but all of these suggestions are going to be rejected. So now the Gemara says Tashma. Let's look at our Mishnah. I'm 2 lines from the bottom of Samach Gimel Amud Bet. If I sell you a house, it does not include the roof if it has a ma'akeh, a parapet around the roof, which is 10 tefachim tall. Now, if you hold the bistama, kane umka, if in general, when I sell you something, it includes the heights without saying anything, without specifying, which is against Rav Dimi, okay, if we were to go against Rav Dimi, then the Mishnah would be unnecessary, or actually incomprehensible. Meaning, okay, this is about a bit of a double negative. What it means is our Mishnah must fit with Rav Dimi, because otherwise the Mishnah doesn't make sense. Because if Bistama, you get the air, right, everything above and everything below, then, right, forget about the bore. You don't get the bore, but you would, if you don't go with Rav Dimi, if you'd said umka veruma, it would include the bore, because if you didn't say anything, it would include everything above and everything below. So ki gavoa sarat tvachim I have. So then why wouldn't you get, if I sell you my house and you get everything above and everything below, well, then the roof would be yours. So what does it matter if there's, right, the Mishnah distinguishes between whether there's 10 tefachim in the parapet or whether there isn't, right? Whether this railing, however we call it, parapet railing around the roof has 10 tefachim or doesn't have 10 tefachim, why should that make a difference? In general, when you sell a house, if, again, you go against Rav Dimi, which is why they want to prove Rav Dimi from here, there would be no difference if it has a ma'akeh around, doesn't have a ma'akeh, either which way, it should be included in the sale. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not true. And this reminds us of things we learn in Masechet Shabbat or Eruvin and a bunch of other places in the Gemara, which is kevan digavoa sarat tvachim chashiv. In other words, when I sell you a house, it includes the roof. However, if the roof has a ma'akeh going around that's 10 tefachim high, that already puts this roof in a different category. Then it's its own domain and not included in a house. So even if you hold by Rav Dimi or don't hold by Rav Dimi, either which way, in other words, you could also not hold by Rav Dimi and say that it does include the roof, but it doesn't include a roof that has ma'akeh, that's 10 tefachim tall, because that already is considered an entity in and of itself. We learned it, by the way, in Sukkah also, right? Anything that's 10 tefachim high has significance. It's its own, right? In Rishut Yachid, we call it, in Shabbat, we call it Rishut Yachid. It's its own domain. So that would explain it not having anything to do with Rav Dimi. So now the Gemara is going to try the third attempt, which is, again, as I said before, so 2 attempts were brought to prove Rav Dimi from 2 Mishnayot, our Mishnah, and yesterday was the upcoming Mishnah. But both were unsuccessful, and now we get to the third, which is an attempt to show that Rav Papa actually disagrees with Rav Dimi. And we're going to quote a sugya that we saw also in yesterday's daf. Amalei Ravina le Rav Ashi. So Ravina says to Rav Ashi, Tashma. Let's learn from here. Now, learn from, I've already mentioned this, and here's a great example to show a point methodologically, which is certain words are used and we know what they're doing. If we have a word meitive, we know that that's coming to raise a question from a Tannaitic source, to raise a difficulty with an amora. Okay, or so it's a word that says difficulty is coming up. The word tashma is a word that could mean many things, and in our case, it actually means it's something and the opposite of it in these 2 sources. And it doesn't necessarily mean we know we're quoting a Tannaitic source. It's just bringing in something from somewhere else. Could be a Mora, it could be a Tana, and that's what we see here. The first Tashma we started with was a Tannaitic source. The second Tashma is going to be a Moraim talking. And the first one was an attempt to prove, and the second one is an attempt to show there's a difference of opinion here. So Tashma just means that we're bringing something from outside. Okay, outside could be anywhere, right? Could be from our Mishnah, could be from right, anywhere. But it's just saying I'm quoting something and I'm using it to relate to something we've been discussing. But again, whether it's a difficulty, whether it's a support, whether it's a Tannaitic source, whether it's a Moraim source, it could be any one of those following things. So Ravina now is going to start with a quote from Rish Lakish. If you remember, we had the statement of Rish Lakish, and on it there was a machloket between Rav Zvid and Rav Papa. And what we're really focusing here, just so I tell you from the get-go, is Rav Papa. That's the one that's going to interest us in this whole thing. To Amar Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish had said, Zot omeret, we can learn from this other source, HaMocher bayit lechaveiro, va'amar lo, amanat shejuta al yonah sheli, juta al yonah shelo. If someone sells a house, okay, he derives from some other situation, that, right, if you remember, once there's these extra words that are unnecessary, they must be coming to say something. If you say, HaMocher bayit lechaveiro, and you say, Al minat shejuta al yonah sheli, I am reserving the upper level for myself, the upper level belongs to that person. They said, well, what's this teaching? Because remember, if you sell a house, it usually doesn't include the roof. So this jutal yonah, which we kind of assume is the roof, or at least we think is the upper level, well, it's already included. So why do you need to say the word almanat? What is he talking about? What does Rish Lakish mean? So what's the relevance of what Ravina is saying, of Rish Lakish is saying? So Rav Zvid Amar, she'im ratza lotzi bazizin motzi. So like I told you already, this isn't relevant to our purposes, but they're quoting it because Rav Papa is going to disagree. And if you remember, when we learned this, we said that there's a debate about what exactly this means, but we'll go with Rashbam. If I sell you a house, I keep the roof for myself. That's standard. That's the Mishnah. The roof is mine. Again, assuming it has ma'akeh of 10 tvachim. The roof is mine. But the courtyard was yours because you got the house with the courtyard, at least according to the Rashbam. What if I want to extend protrusions from the roof, which is mine, but it goes into if I extend a protrusion from the roof, it's going to go into the airspace of your courtyard that I just sold you. Am I allowed to do that? So comes Rav Zvid to say that what Rish Lakish was referring to is only if I say the words Almanat jutal yonah sheli, what am I going to get? What do I get? What's the jutal yonah sheli? What does it mean then? It means that I get the rights to protrude something from the roof that was my own into the airspace of your courtyard. That's what it means. Rav Papa Amal. Now that has nothing to do with Rav Zvid, okay? But Rav Papa Amal, she'im ratza livnot aliyah al gaba boneh. Now we're going to understand Rav Papa differently than we understood Rav Papa before, because what the Gemara is going to do right now is understand Rav Papa in one way, say that would really reject, if you really understood that literally, it would go against Rav Dimi. And then the Gemara is going to say not necessarily, because it could be you understand Rav Papa differently. And the way we understood Rav Papa originally was based on the conclusion of our sugya. So first we're going to understand Rav Papa differently, which is, what Rish Lakish is saying here is that if I sell you a house and I add the words, which seem to be unnecessary, as long as I leave the upper level for myself, what does it mean the upper level? Well, the roof is already kept for me. So what must I be adding? That if I want to build above the roof, I can. Okay? If I want to build a level on top of the roof, let's say I want to build another story. If I sold you the house and I said, on account that I can keep the upper level for me, that means the rights to build above the roof. That's what I kept for myself. Now, what would this imply, though? That if I didn't say anything, it would be bistama, right? Which would say, isak datach bistama lo kane. If we say that if I sell you a house, I'm just selling you what's built in the house and not the umkavaruma, not the airspace above it, well then, lama li almanat, then I don't even need to say almanat. No matter what, when I sell you the house, I'm only, according to Rav Dimi said, if I sell you the house and I don't say kavaruma, all you get is that built house. You don't get the airspace above. So I wouldn't need to say almanat to reserve myself the rights to build above the roof, because if I never sold that to you, I only sold you the house itself, not the space below or above. So Rav Papa would seem to go against Rav Dimi. However, the Gemara says, no, that's not what Rav Papa meant. Ahanele almanat inafal hadarbani. Really, you can explain this according to Rish Lakish. I'm sorry, according to Rav Dimi. How would you explain this according to Rav Dimi? You would say the following. If I sold you the house, I sold you, okay, I don't sell you one second, Bistama lokane, right? You didn't gain any building rights, which means that I reserve the rights to build above the roof if I wanted to. That's not what we're discussing here. When I said almanat, because you didn't get that anyway, and then this goes with Rav Dimi, okay? I didn't need to reserve myself the rights to build another level above the roof. If the roof is mine, I can build above the roof. However, what isn't mine? Well, if I keep the roof to myself, I really only keep the roof itself. If the roof collapses, and this is how we understood Rav Papa yesterday, if the roof collapses, what happens? I can't rebuild it because all I kept was the built roof for myself. You automatically have what? The rights to the air. So now that the roof collapsed, the airspace is all yours. But what? If I said, it means the upper level is mine always. That means if the roof collapses, I can rebuild the roof where it was. And that's what it means, or at least possibly what Rav Papa meant, which means Rav Papa doesn't disagree with Rav Dimi. Because they both agree, though, that I don't have rights to build above. I can't build another level because all the airspace belongs to you. The only thing that belongs to me is that roof itself that's built. And according to Rav Papa, the rights to rebuild it if it collapses. But again, rebuild it in the size that it was and not any higher because the airspace doesn't belong to me. Okay, so that's our section here. We're finished. We started with Rav Dimi, and then we had 2 attempts to try to prove Rav Dimi from Mishnas. 1 attempt to say Rav Papa disagrees with Rav Dimi, but none of those attempts were successful. Okay, in the Hebrew class this morning, it was very nice because somebody said after class, she took a whole course in basically expropriation of land and the legal elements of it. And that this really relates to the whole topic of expropriation of land, like, for example, building tunnels. You want to build a tunnel underneath someone's land. Is that right? Does it belong to that person? Does it not? What has to be done? And that, really, she said it was reminiscent of all the issues that came up in the class. Okay, so for further research, now getting to the next Mishnah, which we already read, and we already related to this from a bunch of different angles, different points, but now we'll learn the Mishnah head on, and then we'll have a whole deliberation about this Mishnah. Lo tabul velo tadut. So if I sell a house, it doesn't include not a bore, not a pit, and not a dut, not a cistern. Soon we'll see what the difference is. Even if you said depths or heights, it doesn't include the bore or the cistern, the pit or the cistern. And here comes the big halacha that we're going to focus on, which is, in addition, now if I sold you my house, but I kept the bore for myself, I need to buy an access route through your house to get to my bore, okay? Which is a little bit crazy. I sold you my house. I kept part of the bore, which is on your property. And now the only way I could get to my bore is going through your house. Well, if I want to get to my bore that I kept for myself, I would have to pay you to be able to get through your house. Without paying you, I have no access route. I can't just go in whenever I want. Rabbis say, what are you talking about? I don't need to buy a path. Of course, if I kept the bore, I obviously retained for myself not only the bore, but an access route to get to the bore. I'll already tell you, even though we learned this already also, that the premise of the machloket here, although we're going to have a bit of a deliberation about this, but we're going to assume right now that the premise of this Mishnah, and we'll see in a minute why it's pretty obvious this is the case, is that Rabbi Akiva holds that when somebody sells, they sell be'ayin yafa. That means they sell generously. So if I sold you a house, I sold everything. Even if it means that now I'm going to have to buy an access route, right? And that is, again, obviously I sold generously, not too generously because I kept the bore and the dupe, but that's because I said house and I didn't say pit or cistern. Or I didn't say all the way down to the depths and all the way up to the heights, or depending on Rav Dimi, not Rav Dimi, but basically, I didn't keep an access route because I sell generously. Well, what does it mean I sell generously? Because otherwise you're not going to want to buy if I don't sell you generously. Chachamim say, no, I sell in a sparing way. I basically keep things, whatever is necessary for myself, I'm going to keep for myself. Right? When I sell, a seller, we don't assume gives whatever they want away. No, if they're going to need something, they're going to keep it for themselves. Umode Rabbi Akiva, continuing now in the Mishnah. Mode Rabbi Akiva bisman she'amar lo chutz me'ele she'en tzarich likach derech. There's only one case where Rabbi Akiva will agree with the rabbis, and that's if I added, again, like we talked about before, unnecessary words. I said the words, I'm selling you my house, other than the bore and the dut, meaning I'm not selling you the bore and the dut, but if I say I'm selling you my house, it anyway doesn't include the bore and the dut. So I don't need to say that. So if I say that, just like with the dutal yonah, I don't need to say I'm keeping the roof because anyway I keep the roof. So it must mean something else. Here also, it must mean something else. What does it mean? It must mean I'm saving myself an access route. Said, other than the bore and the dut means I'm selling you my house, but make sure I can get through your house to go to the bore and the dut, and I'm not going to pay you more money. I'm not going to pay you money for that. Now, case 2. Mecharan la'achir. Here we're going to flip. It's the same kind of idea. There's a house and there's a pit. But instead of me selling the house and keeping the pit, I sell the pit and keep the house. All I do is I sell you the pit in my yard, wherever it is. So I sold you the pit. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Now the question is, do you need to buy an access route? So let's just do the logic before we read it inside. If we go with our previous assumption, which is that Rabbi Akiva holds, when I sell generously. So now it's going to be the reverse. If I sell my house and I sell generously, it means I've given you I don't keep any access route for myself. I have to buy it. But if I sell you the pit, and we assume I sell generously, then it means I sold you an access route and you wouldn't need to buy an access route. The buyer here doesn't need to buy an access route, as opposed to the seller in the first case. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, ein no tzarich likach lo derech. So if you notice, right, Rabbi Akiva in the first situation said, I would have to buy an access route as the seller. But the buyer would need to buy an access route because if you say, mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, then you're basically saying the buyer always gets more. So if the buyer gets more in the first case, I'm going to have to buy an access route. If the buyer gets more in the second case, the buyer doesn't need an access route because I gave the buyer everything. So it's the same logic. It just comes out the opposite because the case is opposite. The rabbis say, no, the person who buys the bore bought a bore. It didn't say with an access route. As long as you don't say with an access route, obviously you mean without an access route because Sellers sell in a sparing way, which means I sold you the pit, and that's it. I didn't sell you the access route to get to there. So you would have to buy a path to get there. So now we get to the Gemara, and the first thing the Gemara is going to do, so there's basically two sugyot. The first sugyot is very simple, the second one's a little more complicated. Yativ Ravina v'takashile. So Ravina starts out and says, I don't understand something in this Mishnah. Hainu bor, hainu dut. A pit and a cistern, aren't they one and the same? Why do you need to mention them both? Right? The Mishnah, the assumption is kind of like we say about the Torah. There's nothing unnecessary. So why would they say bor and dut? No real reason. So, ask the question, why do we have both cases? Amalei Rav Tosfa'a the Ravina. Rav Tosfa'a says to Ravina the following, Tashma, let's learn from here what the difference is. They're not exactly the same. Ditanya, it says in a Braita, Echad habol ve'echad hadut bekarka. They're both in the ground. Ela shahabol b'chafira v'hadut b'binyan. The bore is dug into hard rock or hard soil, which means, right, probably not hard rock, but hard soil, which means that when you have a bore there and you dig it, all you have to do is dig, and then it stands and it can hold water. It doesn't need sealing or anything like that. But a dut is bibidyan. That means you have to build inside. What they would do is they would put stones, usually to line the bottom and the sides, and that would prevent the water from just seeping into the ground and basically you having no water to store up there. So there are two different types of ways of digging pits. Now, who cares still, right? Why would the Mishnah have to mention them both? And the Gemara doesn't say this, but the Rashbam says it basically. So let's look in the Rashbam. The Rashbam points out, so why do we need both? If you look at the Rashbam, the very end of the daf, 3 lines from the bottom in the Rashbam in the Dibor Matchil B'Binyan, skipping the first line, Hilkach itana bor, if you had the just bor, what we have to show is why you need bor and dut, why you couldn't have just learned one from the other. Well, if you had bor, you would think, havamina hanimile bor shehu b'chafira. That would mean a bor that was b'chafira is not included in the sale of a house. Why? Right? Because it's just something dug. It's not a house, right? It's not similar to a house in any way. Aval dut shehu b'binyan ke'ein habayit hareu b'chlal bayit. Maybe when I sell you a house, I mean anything built. And if we call a dut, a cistern, something built because it has stones in it, maybe it would be included in the sale of a house. And now we have to say the opposite logic. If you have dut, why wouldn't you have known bor? If dut is not included, according to that logic, well, then bor wouldn't be included. But now they're going to say, if you just have dut, shehu b'binyan, itana dut, mishum de binyan b'fnei atzmohu b'chashiv. Just like we said with the roof, if it has a wall of 10, well, then it's already significant in and of itself, and it wouldn't be included in a sale. So you could say that a dut is built with stones, it's got significance on its own, and it wouldn't be included in the sale of a house. But just something dug in the ground perhaps would be kind of what we say, batel to the house. It would be secondary to the house and would be basically included in the sale of a house. So on that logic, you had to say them both because you wouldn't have known one from the other. And now we're going to see the exact same thing twice. Always fun for Daf Yomi. You get to go through a section pretty quickly. Repeat of this sugya just with different names. The same question, instead of being asked by Ravina, in this case it's asked by Rav Ashi, and instead of being answered by Rav Tosfa'a, it's going to be answered by Mar Kashisha. So why the Gemara brings both, I'm not really sure. Yativ Rav Ashi v'kashela. So Rav Ashi sat and questioned and said, Hainu bor, hainu dut. Aren't these both the same thing? To which Amarle Mar Kashisha b'reid Rav Chisda Rav Ashi. So Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chisda, answered Rav Ashi and said, Tashma, let's learn it from this Braita. Braita is going to set up the difference. It's the exact same Braita we quoted before. Okay, exact repeat. Now we'll move on. Now we get to the real section of the heavy section of the Gemara, or the serious one, which is what's the rule of the machloket between Rabbi Akiva and rabbis, which we already explained, although the Gemara didn't say so, the Mishnah didn't say so, but we're going to, again, assume that what the Mishnah is based upon is that according to Rabbi Akiva, again, we're talking about the access route, mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, someone who sells generously and therefore gives up their own access route, or in the second case, right, keeps the access route is given to the person who buys the bore, okay? And according to the rabbis, it's the opposite. Someone sells sparingly, so the buyer is the one who's going to either keep the access route for themselves, or get the access route for themselves, or keep out the seller from having an access route. So that's what the Gemara says. First, they're just quoting it to Rabbi Akiva. They're quoting the first section of the Mishna. It's just a quote. My la b'hakam palge, is this not the root of the machloket turning out on the bet? Do Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, Rabbanan savar mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher? Okay, is that not the root of the machloket? And the Gemara further adds an interesting point, which is Ude ka'amrina nami ba'alma. Rabbi Akiva. Now, the Gemara is quoting itself. When you see it quoted in the Gemara, the following statement, that where some opinion of Rabbi Akiva is quoted in the rabbis, and it says, oh, you should just know that Rabbi Akiva l'tameh, Rabbi Akiva is consistent within his approach. De amar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher mehacha. What the Gemara is saying is an interesting line, which is, anytime, basically they're saying, this is a well-known statement that you'll see quoted throughout Shas, and whenever it says, oh yeah, this is Rabbi Akiva who holds mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, where does that all come from? Our Mishnah. Okay, that's all derived from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is the source for a well-known machloket between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis. That's the Gemara's statement right now. And we could have ended there. But the Gemara says, I'm not so sure. Maybe you can't necessarily learn it from our Mishnah. And in fact, in the end, they're going to conclude that you don't really learn it from our Mishnah. Okay, we're going to have 4 sections to the Gemara right now. The first is to say, Mimai, why are you assuming that's the basis for our Mishnah and that it's all learned from here? Nobody disagrees that everyone thinks that Rabbi Akiva holds mocher ba'ayin yafa and the rabbis hold mocher ba'ayin ra'a, and we've seen that in Sugyot before. That's not the question. The question is the source for that machloket our Mishnah? So now they say, Mimai, Dilma Rabbi Akiva savar ein adam rotzeh she'itei ma'otav yidrisuhu achirim. Maybe the basis for Rabbi Akiva, and in a minute we'll say the basis for the rabbis, is something else. Rabbi Akiva holds, okay, we're now dealing with just the first section of the Mishnah. I sold you my house, but I kept the boar for myself, but I didn't keep an access route. Why not? Because you never would have bought it had I done that. Why? Because ein adam rotzeh she'itei ma'otav, the buyer would never pay money for something knowing that someone else is going to traipse through there. Why on earth would I buy a house, or would you buy the house, because you're the buyer in this case, when you know that I'm going to just be walking through your house whenever I want? So you might be willing to do it if I'll pay you money for it. Then, right, there's a lot of things we're not willing to do, but if we get money for them, we're all of a sudden willing to do them, but not for free. The Rabbanan savre. Now, in order for a sale to take place, as we say, it takes 2 to tango, right? You need both sides. So Rabbi Akiva is focusing on the buyer. The buyer would never buy it unless that was the case. And the rabbis hold, Rabbanan savre, focusing more on the seller. And this is where the Gemara, I find, they'd like to be a little comical. Ein adam rotzeh she'ito ma'ot v'yifrach ba'avil. A seller wouldn't take money for something, sell their house in a way that it would totally inconvenience them, that they'd have to fly in the air, which obviously people can't fly. They would have to fly in the air to get to their boar, right? If I have to buy my way, right, then maybe I don't want to spend the money to do that. The only way I could get there would be to fly. Well, that's not so convenient, not even not convenient, but not really doable. And therefore, there's no way I would have sold you my house and totally inconvenienced myself, that now I have no way to get to my boar. So each one is focusing on a different element. And the assumption here is that each one only is thinking one side and not both, right? That they don't think both are considerations. One thinks it's people won't buy something if that means someone's going to traipse their house. And the other one thinks people won't sell something if it makes their lives totally inconvenient. So in that case, the Gemara says, you're right. We can't learn this famous machloket from our Mishnah, because it could be it's a different issue. To which the Gemara says, well, elami seifa. So let's learn it from the second part of our Mishnah. Micharan la'acher. Remember the second part? If I sell just the boar, Rabbi Akiva omer eino tzarich likach lo derech, v'chachamim omrim tzarich. Okay, now the Gemara adds there's a bet here which goes to the Bach, and the Bach adds some words because it's sort of cut off in the middle. And I'm going to read the whole thing through the Bach, Okay, and does this not prove then? In other words, what they're doing now is the second attempt to say, okay, fine. We couldn't prove this famous machloket from our first part of our Mishnah, but let's prove it from the second part of our Mishnah. The Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafam mocher, v'Rabbanan savar mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. Now, why would this prove it more? Because here we don't have the same claims. It's not that the buyer won't put money down if they're worried someone's going to traipse through their house, because the buyer doesn't have the house here, right? The house is not the buyer's. It's the buyer needs us, right? The house is the seller's. And the seller doesn't need to, we don't have this comment of, oh, well, I wouldn't take money and have to inconvenience myself. Seller doesn't have to inconvenience themselves. So those claims are no longer relevant, okay? So you can't therefore say that that's the reason. And therefore, perhaps from here you could say it's ayin ra'ah and ayin yafa, which, as I explained already in the Mishnah, that again, the seller, according to Rabbi Akiva, doesn't need to buy an access route because the buyer who bought the pit doesn't need an access route because when the seller sold generously, and therefore obviously sold an access route. The rabbis would say, no, has to buy an access route because obviously when I sold my pit, I kept I kept as much as I could to myself because I sold sparingly, in which case they would have to buy an access route, and that would be proven then from the second part of the Mishnah. But that's also not going to work. Why not? Dilma b'hai plige, even that second part of the Mishnah you could say is different, because you could say it's based on a different logic. Now this is similar to mocher ba'ayin yafa and ra'ah, and I'm going to preface this, so I'm going to clarify how it's different, because we'll see right now. To Rabbi Akiva savar batar data de lokech hazlina, v'Rabbanan savre batar data mocher hazlina. And I'm going to add the words of the Rashbam because that will, I think, put it a little bit more in context. The Rashbam says, I'm going to read in the Rashbam, okay, inside. Dilma baha plige to Rabbi Akiva. I'll just first say it simply in words. Rabbi Akiva says we're going to, in a case of deliberation, who says what, or who gets what, we're going to side with, always we're going to side with the buyer. And Rabbanan, we're going to say always we're going to side with the seller. But now I'm going to add a lot more that's going to make this make a little bit more sense. Because why is that different from mocher ba'ayin yafa, mocher ba'ayin ra'ah? It's also siding with the same side. So let's understand the difference. What they're trying to say, according to the Rashbam, is klomar, look at the Rashbam here, bein Rabbanan, bein Rabbi Akiva, chashiva lehu shtei tanot. This is a building on the previous. They both think, it's not that the rabbis think the issue is, I'm not going to want to fly in the air. And Rabbi Akiva thinks, I don't want someone traipsing through my house. No, it's that they both think that both of those are issues. No one's going to, right? No one's going to want people traipsing through their house, and no one's going to want to have to fly in the air to get to somewhere. However, in this case, right, there's a pull of both those issues. Both those issues are issues. So when you don't know what to do, we're going to end up saying Rabbi Akiva is going to side with the buyer, and the rabbi is just going to side with the seller. And that fits in well with that. Now, what's the logic to say this? Not because of mocher ba'ayin yafa, mocher ba'ayin ra'ah. It's because, and the Rashbam continues and explains, that according, and I'll just read some of the words inside, de'ein adam mashlif ma'otav le'ibud. People don't throw money out for no good reason. You're not going to put money down unless it's good for you. Right? I'm not going to spend money unless it's a good sale. So that's why we're going to always side with the buyer, because the buyer would never agree to something unless it's good for them. So it doesn't have to do with, is the seller selling generously or not? It has to do with, would the buyer actually buy this with these inconveniences, right? That's the whole thing. There's inconveniences here. So therefore, we're going to say, no, a buyer would never buy if it's not good for them. And that's why the buyer is going to get the upper hand is with the buyer. And the rabbis are going to hold based on a different principle that's known, which is Yad Bal Hashtar ala Tachtona. The one who has the document, they're actually, the upper hand is with the other side. So they're on the underhanded side. And who's the Bal Hashtar? When you buy something, you keep the document. The buyer is in the weaker position when there's this issue. And the Rashbam points out, why is this relevant? Because in the end, you still get to the same thing of mocher ba'ayin yafa, mocher ba'ayin ra'ah. It's not so different. The difference is that this would only be applicable in a case like our Mishnah, where there's an inconvenience to the other side, right? Where we have two things pulling and then we have to say, well, which side are we going to side on? But if it's, let's say, okay, he brings an example of you sold a tree, do you get the land with it? So there's no issue of flying in the air or traipsing on someone's property. If those issues are neutralized, then perhaps they don't have a machloket. And therefore, from our Mishnah, we now conclude we can't say that our Mishnah is the source for this mocher b'ayin yafa, mocher b'ayin ra'ah, because our Mishnah is a particularly unique case where there's these other issues at stake of flying in the air, or right, not having an access route at all, or having someone traipse through your house. And perhaps the machloket is only in a case like that. So we're going to continue. Section 3. Okay, section 1 was, right, we started with, we learned it from our Mishnah, the first part of our Mishnah. Then we said not necessarily. It could be, it's a machloket about, are we more worried you can fly in the air? We're more worried, that you don't want to have to fly in the air. We're more worried, you're worried someone's going to traipse through your house. And that's the machloket. And we said, no, at least maybe from the Seifa you could learn it. And then they say, no, because maybe that's all. They both agree. Right now we're saying maybe they both agree that both these are issues. The question becomes, right, when we have these issues, and then it's only when we have these issues, do we side with the buyer or do we side with the seller based on these other factors? Now we say, okay, fine. So you can't learn it from our Mishnah, maybe from a Mishnah on Daf Ayin Aleph. Okay, a few dapim to get there, another 7 dapim. Elameha, maybe from this Mishnah. Now our Mishnah had said, when you buy a house, it doesn't include the bor and the dud. That Mishnah says, when you buy a field, not a house, but a field, lo et habor, velo et hagat, velo et hashovach, you don't get the pit, even though the pit is full of water to water the field, so it's connected. Not the gat, which is what you use, your wine press, to take your grapes from your field or your vineyard. And right, again, these things all somehow serve the field, and yet they're not included. Below it hashovach, and not the dovecote, even though perhaps it's for the doves that are in the field, or maybe it's not as related to the field. Either which way, it doesn't include any of these things, bein charevim, bein yeshuvim, whether they're not used at all, or whether they are used. Now, it could be a dovecote with no doves. It could be a pit with no water. Doesn't matter. Whether it's used or whether it's not used, whether it's full, not full, it doesn't make a difference. It stays with the original owner. It's not part of the deal. Vitzarich likach lo derech. And note what machloket appears there, the exact same machloket. Now, the premise of this is going to be, it's unnecessary. This goes back to what we've been talking about all day. When words are unnecessary, they must be coming to teach something else. There it was words in a sale were unnecessary. It must be including something more. Here it's words in a Mishnah. It's different, but it's still saying words in a Mishnah are unnecessary. Why would we say it if not to teach you something else? And then we'll say, what else must it be teaching? That this is a bigger machloket, and it applies not just in a case where there's issues of traipsing in someone's field or house, or not just when you're going to have to fly in the air, but it's relevant in all cases. Ki mocher b'ayin yafa mocher or mocher b'ayin ra'ah mocher. That's basically the idea here. So let's read it inside. V'tzarich likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva. So again, if I sell you my field, but I keep my wine press to myself, then I have to buy an access route through your field. And the rabbis say, no, I don't. Hatu lamali, why do I need this? We already know this whole machloket between them from our Mishnah. You don't need to repeat it 7 dapim later. Or in those days, it wasn't in dapim, it was a Mishnah. You don't need to repeat the Mishnah. Hatu lamali, so why do we need all this? Kamash malan, it must be, hakamash malan, it must be coming to teach you that this is a broader machloket. Again, the idea being, it's not just in a case like our Mishnah, it must be in a broader case as well. To Rabbi Akiva savar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher, v'Rabbanan savar mocher b'ayin ra'ah mocher. Okay, and that's all because this Mishnah is unnecessary. To which the Gemara says, "What do you mean it's unnecessary?" Remember, I told you there's 4 sections, so we're still only on number 3. Again, we started with part 1 of our Mishnah, part 2 of our Mishnah, part 1 of the Mishnah Ayin Aleph. We're now going to say, no, this is not unnecessary. It was necessary. Why was it necessary? Well, maybe it taught us a house, and then it had to teach us a field, and it was necessary to. You couldn't have learned one from the other. Why is that? Now, focusing on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, when I sell my house, right, and not my pit, I have to buy an access route. Why do I have to buy an access route? You could say, specifically for a house, I have to buy an access route, but not for a field. Why? Because because in a house, a lot of private things go on. You're not going to just let me go through your house and invade your privacy whenever I want, unless I pay you money for it. Again, like I said before, once you pay money, people are willing to do things that are a little inconvenient. But if you don't pay me money for it, right? Or again, here it's talking about the buyer. If I didn't pay money when I sold you my house, and I didn't pay you money for it, you're not going to let me traipse through your house. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would only say that in a house, but not a field. A field, nobody does anything private. There's no tzniut in a field. So maybe Rabbi Akiva would think that maybe I don't need to buy an access route because maybe you're willing to let me walk through your field. And here, on that same logic, yashmin on sadeh, then you could say, well, then just teach us the sadeh, and then we would know the house. If Rabbi Akiva would say, you're not going to allow me to walk through your field, you're obviously not going to let me walk through your house. But no, because you could say opposite logic, which is yashmin on sadeh, mishum de kashe le davsha. When it comes to a field, if I traipse through your field, okay, right? Remember, I kept the board for myself, and I want to get through there. I'm going to step on your crops and ruin your crops. But in your house, so I went through your house, but again, if we ignore the privacy issue, I didn't ruin anything on your floor. There's nothing on your floor that could be ruined. The floors were just made of dirt. So I walked through your house, but I didn't ruin any crops that were growing. So maybe you don't care that I walked through your house. And that's why we needed the first part of that Mishnah to teach you a new halacha. And therefore you can't say it's unnecessary, which then comes to teach this is part of a bigger topic. To which the Gemara is going to finally conclude, last section for today, Ela Miseifa. We're going to learn it from the Seifa, meaning the Seifa of that Mishnah, though, is really unnecessary. Why? Because the Seifa there matches the Seifa in our case. Because remember, in our Mishnah it was, I sold you a house, kept the boar. The second case was, I sold you the boar, but kept the house. So there, it talks about, I sold you the field, but kept the boar, or the god, or whatever it might be. And the second part is going to be the reverse case. Now, once we have the first case, we don't need the second case there. It's already very clear. So Ela Miseifa, where it says, Mecharan la'acher, if I sold you the boar, or the gat, or the shovach, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eno tzarich likach lo derech, v'chachamim omrim tzarich. Hatu lamali, that already, right? Their positions match up. Why is that case needed? It's not needed at all. Hainu hach, they're really one and the same. And therefore, finally conclude, Elalav shmamina, Elalav hakamashman, it must be coming to teach us that it's not just in a case where you're worried someone's going to trample your stuff, or it's not just a case where you're worried, again, this is a case where you're worried someone's going to trample, or you're going to have to fly in the air. Not just a case like that. This is the reason why it's repeated, is to teach you something additional, which is, this is part of a broader concept. This applies across the board in all sales. When someone sells, according to Rabbi Akiva, they're selling generously, and everything that you think would be, maybe included is included. And according to the rabbis, again, it's not anything's included, because that's all these Mishnayot we've been learning. This is not included in the sale of this. But the things that are questionable, like a path to get there, that would be definitely included. In other words, I wouldn't get, again, it depends which way you're going. Whoever buys it is getting more. So it would mean either blocking my access route, or maybe they would get their own access route. So, hatu lamali hanu hach, right? This is all a repeat. Elalav hakamash, must teach you, Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Akiva thinks always when you're selling generously. Rabbanan savar mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. And the rabbi said, no, you're selling stingily. So, and sparingly. Shma mina. From there, we can conclude that, and that's the conclusion of our Gemara. So we'll stop here for today. What I want to just do is a review of the sugya. We started with Rav Dimi min Hadran and his statement about, right, from already yesterday's daf, about what a sale of a house includes. Does it include the umka baruma? No, it doesn't, he said. We had 2 attempts, one yesterday, one today, to prove it from Mishnayot. Unsuccessful. Then we tried to say Rav Papa disagrees, also unsuccessful. Then we moved to this next Mishnah about the sale of a house doesn't include a pit or a cistern. We got into what's the difference between a pit and a cistern, and why are they both necessary, even though the Gemara didn't say why they're both necessary, but the Rashbam helped us out with that. And then we got into this big machloket Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis in our Mishnah about the access route, And we said that it must be based on this bigger, broader machloket, which is actually learned from here. And then the Gemara said, no, it's not really learned from here. In the end, you could say it's learned from here, but it's learned from here with a combination of our Mishnah and the second Mishnah, the Mishnah on Daf Ayin Aleph, and particularly the second part, the latter part of that Mishnah, because that, in light of our Mishnah, is totally unnecessary, and it must be unnecessary to teach you that this is a broad concept that applies in sales in general, and not just in cases where you're worried someone's going to trample your property, or you're worried that you'd have to fly and you have no way to get there. So, right, we suggested perhaps, and really concluded, it's possible the logic in our Mishnah has to do with something else, but in the end, the fact that there's a fourth, right, there's 2 sections in our Mishnah, 2 sections in the other Mishnah, and that last one is unnecessary, must come to teach us such a general principle and applies across the board. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Nice to be back on Zoom. Nice to see people. And we'll continue tomorrow.